Okay. Look, instruments! Yay! What do they have in common, do you think? I don't see any kind of wind instruments, no piano nor organ. I don't see no brass, no trumpet, no drums. The harp is lurking inconveniently there in the back, just ignore it. What do they have in common, these instruments? Well, they're all played with the fingers from one hand selecting a note somewhere by pressing down at some point on one or several strings, which changes the length of the string and therefore the note produced when sounding it. And the other hand is causing the note to sound by either plucking, hitting, or using a bow or something of the sort. Again, that doesn't apply to the harp. You're not playing with only one hand on the harp. Also know that they all have strings, a body and a neck, except the harp. We're always excluding the harp. I was going to call instruments that work like this position instruments because the hand that is pressing down on strings changes position along the neck or equivalent part of the instrument in order to play notes in a higher register for each string. In the previous video, if you remember, I talked about position instruments and regrettably explained that the next video would be about those so-called position instruments. And I thought that perhaps a characteristic that better defines said instruments is the existence of open strings. That is, of strings that will sound one note when they aren't shortened by one hand. That is, when you play on the open string. And play other notes when you press down on the string at various points, for example on the violin or on the guitar. Then I thought of calling them fingered open string instruments. Pretty catchy, right? Fingered open string instruments. But then it crossed my mind that the harp does not belong to the group I'm trying to name, and yet it is fingered, and it has open strings. So that name doesn't really differentiate the family of instruments from an instrument like the harp. A violinist or a guitarist does something one does not do on the harp. They will shorten the strings with their fingers so that when they make the string sound, whether by bowing or plucking, the string will play different notes than it would have without having been shortened. So I came up with shortened string instruments. Sounds even worse, so unsatisfied I continued to try to find a better name. Then I asked myself if there was a name out there already for this class of instruments. Yeah, perhaps a bit of OCD, the label doesn't matter terribly much. We're trying to distinguish such instruments from others, so I don't have to paraphrase every time I'm trying to designate them, since I'm going to provide a general trick to determine which chords can be played on such instruments. Well, scratch that. A good name might make you learn something more easily. Whatever you think about the importance of labels, I then read that such instruments are distinguished from other instruments by the fact that they are string instruments with a body and a neck. The harp and piano both are string instruments. Well, the piano is somewhat a string instrument since when you hit a note on the keyboard, a hammer inside strikes strings. As for the harp, it has its strings actually visible and your fingers touch them when playing, just as they do on the guitar. When you're playing pizzicato on the violin, the violin, but it doesn't have a neck like the guitar or the viola. So let's just call these instruments string instruments with a neck or lute family instruments, since they also seem to call such instruments that way. At least until I try to find another name again. Hopefully I won't. Perhaps it's a string instrument with a neck that does not belong in our family of instruments, or a string instrument without a neck that does. But as far as I can tell at the moment, this probably largely coincides with the family of instruments we're trying to describe. As long as the fingers of one hand shorten one or more strings of the instrument, and the other hand plays said strings by bowing or plucking or hitting, the instrument belongs to our family of instruments. Of course, the hand that is choosing the notes doesn't always have to be doing anything. The strings can be left alone, and in that case, default notes will sound from the strings when they are at their full length. We call those unmolested strings open strings. Note that you can change the tuning so those notes are not fixed. But on the violin, usually, the notes that sound on the four open strings are G3, D4, A4, and E5, respectively. On the viola, those usual four notes are C3, G3, D4, A4. On the guitar, the six notes are E2, A2, D3, G3, B3, E4. If I'm not mistaken, your left hand has to press down somewhere on the strings, shortening the part that will sound in order to get any other note from said instruments. Anyone who's writing for real orchestral instruments will need to write chords for string instruments at some point, though I suppose it's technically possible you never do that. If you only write quintets, for instance, how do you know which chords can be played and which are impossible on, say, the violin? It's easier to determine what's possible on the piano, for instance, as we saw last time, at least at first glance. What I'm going to propose in the next videos is a way to determine what chords can be played on any string instrument with a neck, though you will need to know a little something more about the way the specific instrument is played. We will discuss this later, but you won't have to know that much. I myself am only familiar with a few instruments of the sort, but the simple trick I'm proposing will work for all of them, provided you know something about how the specific instrument you are working with functions. Next time we will introduce the concept of the spread for LUTE family instruments. Spoiler alert! It's how far your fingers are spread out across the strings. There, I said it. Why make another video? Maybe I shouldn't. Okay, as I said, eventually we will explore how to determine if a chord can be played on a LUTE family instrument, and then we'll visit some specific string instruments with a neck, like the violin or the guitar, and see how the trick applies to them. As usual, like and subscribe. See you next time.